윤석열 정권과 그의 군대는 전면될 것입니다.
North Korea's economy grew 3.5% last year, and it was the third straight year of growth above 3%. Meanwhile, North Korean output has now passed its 2017 level for the first time, which is to say it's climbed back above where it stood before it was hit with the heaviest UN sanctions ever. So, the most sanctioned country out there is having its best decade in a long time. But there's been no major reform, and there hasn't been some Chinese-style grand opening of the economy. So then, what's changed in Pyongyang? Well, today we break down why the North Korean economy has been booming, where the money is actually coming from, and where North Korea likely goes from here. My name is Guy, and this is the Finance Bureau. Okay, let's start with the numbers, because when it comes to North Korea, finding hard data is a bit tricky. Pyongyang stopped publishing meaningful national accounts decades ago. But the Bank of Korea, that's South Korea, has produced its estimate every July since 1991, and the method is production-side accounting. It counts physical or measurable things, tons of cement, kilowatt-hours of electricity, tons of coal and steel, using raw data handed over by South Korea's National Intelligence Service and various government ministries. And then, because the North Korean won is not convertible, it values all of that output using South Korean prices. Now, alongside the central bank, there's an entire industry of estimation. Analysts pull satellite imagery of the peninsula at night, where Pyongyang glows and most of the rest of the country disappears into blackness. Commercial operators like Planet Labs and Maxar photograph the northern ports at Rajin and Nampo, and researchers count shipping containers stack by stack, week by week. They do the same with apartment blocks in Pyongyang. Now, you can't just ask North Korea what it trades, so instead, you have to read China's Customs Administration data and take what Beijing admits it's sold. And then, at the most granular end, outlets like Daily NK and Asia Press phone smuggled mobiles inside the country and ask traders in the markets what a kilogram of rice costs. And people literally count cars in street photographs of Pyongyang. So, the toolkit is good at spotting steel, cement, container stacks and munitions, but it's relatively blind to everything else. Which brings us to what's actually driving the number here, because 3.5% growth doesn't come from nowhere. Mining and manufacturing now make up 30% of North Korea's nominal GDP, with manufacturing output up somewhere between 4.9 and 6.6% year on year. Heavy industry is booming, and there is a very specific reason for that. In June 2024, Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin signed a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty in Pyongyang, complete with mutual defense commitments. What followed was one of the largest sustained arms transfers of the entire Ukraine war, and the largest foreign military supply relationship Pyongyang has ever run. Analysts at the Open Source Center and Royal United Services Institute tracked it the hard way by counting containers moving across the Kherson-Turmangan rail link and by sea from Rajin to Russian Pacific ports. Millions of 152mm and 122mm artillery shells and rockets, KN-23 and KN-24 short-range ballistic missiles, several of which Ukrainian investigators have since pulled out of impact craters. And what's more, aging Soviet-pattern heavy kit has been dragged out of storage, 170mm Koksan self-propelled guns and 240mm multiple rocket launchers, all sent west on flat cars. One assessment has North Korea covering somewhere between a quarter and half of Russia's entire artillery shell requirement. And then, as if that weren't enough, North Korea also sent soldiers. Estimates of the deployment run from around 10,000 at the start up to roughly 21,000 personnel in total, according to South Korea's Institute for National Security Strategy. By early 2026, something like 10,000 were still active in the fighting. South Korea's NIS and British intelligence put casualties at around 6,000 killed and wounded by early this year. Ukraine's military intelligence has since revised that upwards to just over 7,000 for the Kursk campaign. Now, Russia pays roughly $2,000 a month per soldier, with additional payments tied to casualties, and the total wage bill so far is somewhere between $600 million and $849 million. But of course, that money does not go to the soldiers or their families. It goes to the state. North Korea is essentially running a labor export business where the product occasionally gets killed. And in April this year, it opened a museum in the capital to commemorate exactly that. So, what's the total take? Well, in May 2026, South Korean intelligence assessments put North Korea's total earnings from military cooperation with Russia at somewhere around $13 billion. INSS and Bloomberg economics data, published in March, broke it down further. $9.12 billion for shells, $2.38 billion for heavy artillery systems, and $1.27 billion for ballistic missiles, with a ceiling as high as $14.4 billion. And another Bloomberg economics estimate covering 2022 to 2025, which folds in cyber and everything else, puts total foreign currency earnings at up to $22 billion, set against a nominal GDP of a little over $26 billion. But what comes back the other way is probably more important than the cash. Refined petroleum landing at North Korean ports well above the UN's 500,000 barrel annual cap. Wheat, flour, and grain in volumes large enough to move the food security picture. And there's also the thing the sanctions were supposed to prevent: Russian assistance on reconnaissance systems, air defense systems, and ballistic missile guidance. Sanctions were designed to make weapons expensive, but Russia turned them into North Korea's best-paying export. Now, digging around for details on an economy as closed off as North Korea's takes a lot of effort, and piecing together the puzzle on topics like this can be a real headache, which is exactly why you should make it easier for yourself by signing up for the Finance Bureau newsletter. It's completely free, and each week we break down geopolitics and the money flows that end up moving your portfolio. So just click the link in the description or scan this QR code on your screen to get started. Right then, back to North Korea and the other major driver of this economic boom. Because before we credit the UN with inadvertently creating a North Korean bull market, it's worth remembering that Kim Jong-un did far more damage to his own economy than the Security Council ever managed. When he sealed the Chinese border during the pandemic, trade collapsed by 80 to 90%. The economy contracted for 3 years running, down 0.8%, then 4.5%, then 0.2%, and the country ran short of medicine, fertilizer, and food. But reopening that border fixed more than any policy ever could. Full year 2025 trade with China came in at around $2.73 billion against a 2019 pre-COVID baseline of $2.79 billion. So essentially all the way back. A separate measure puts total trade higher at $3.13 billion, up 16%. Either way though, China accounts for over 90% of North Korea's trade with the entire planet, and up to 98% of its exports. But the composition of that trade is where things get a little strange. You see, North Korea's single largest legal export is human hair. Think wigs and false eyelashes, worth $188 million in 2024 and around $205 million in 2025, accounting for somewhere between 40 and 44% of everything the country legally sells abroad. The model is processing on commission. Chinese hair and synthetic fiber goes over the border, gets assembled by extremely cheap North Korean labor, and comes straight back as finished product. Alongside that, there's also ore, and specifically tungsten, which produced one of the odder data points of this year, because between January and May 2026, tungsten briefly overtook wigs as North Korea's top export to China. Not on volume, mind you, but on price. The unit price went up 8-fold, past $90 a kilogram, after Beijing put tungsten under export licensing in February 2025, and the global benchmark soared over 200%. North Korea got a windfall from a Chinese export control it had nothing to do with. Meanwhile, coming the other way, North Korea imports tons of fabric, soybean oil, grain, fertilizer, and plastics. So, the general idea here is that Russia pays the regime and China supplies daily life. And that brings me to the third major driver of North Korea's boom, and strictly speaking, it's the only modern industry the country has: cybercrime. In its report published last December, Chainalysis estimated North Korean state-backed groups stole over $2 billion in cryptocurrency during 2025. That's up 51% on the previous year, taking the all-time total to roughly $6.75 billion. Global crypto theft in 2025 came to about $3.4 billion in total. So, one country accounted for around 60% of everything stolen worldwide. And they did it with roughly 74% fewer individual attacks than the year before. So, there have been fewer heists, but they're very professionally run and vastly bigger. The biggest, in fact, was on the 21st of February 2025, when attackers drained roughly $1.5 billion worth of Ethereum from the crypto exchange Bybit. That was the largest theft by amount stolen in history, and by some distance too. The FBI officially attributed it to North Korea, linking the operation, known as Trader Traitor, to the infamous Lazarus Group, the state-sponsored hacking collective. Bybit has since recovered about $48 million worth and frozen another $30 million worth, but roughly 90% of the stolen funds went dark. But there are other operations. Thousands of North Korean IT workers focusing their efforts on stolen identities, freelancing for Western companies from apartments in China, Russia, and Southeast Asia, often using deepfakes to get through video interviews. Revenue estimates run from a couple of $100 million a year to nearly $800 million. The US Justice Department has been dismantling the domestic side, raiding dozens of laptop farms and jailing operators who placed North Korean workers inside hundreds of American companies. One Maryland case involved a North Korean national in China remotely handling software contracts for the Federal Aviation Administration. And when the contracts end, some of these workers steal source code and extort the employer, or simply sell the access on. Now, remember, none of this money crosses a border or gets valued in South Korean prices by anyone at the Bank of Korea, which means the measured economy and the real economy are two very different beasts. So then, what did all of it actually build? Well, the showpiece is the Wonsan Kalma Coastal Tourist Zone. 4 kilometers of beachfront and hotel towers opened personally by Kim Jong-un back in July 2025 with a claimed capacity of 20,000 guests. Foreign access was almost immediately restricted to Russian tour groups. According to Russian FSB figures, 9,985 Russians visited North Korea last year, the most since records began in 2010. Of whom around 5,075 were tourists, arriving on Air Koryo and Nordwind flights from Vladivostok. A week-long package costs about $1,800, which is roughly 60% more than the average Russian monthly salary. And by late summer, arrivals had slowed to a trickle. Then there's the housing. The 8th Party Congress in 2021 set a target of 50,000 new apartments in Pyongyang in 5 years, and in February 2026, the state declared it complete, with the final 10,000 units in Hwasong district handed to the families of soldiers killed abroad. Then there's the 20 times 10 policy, planting modern factories in 20 provincial counties a year. However, various analysts have all found the same thing, which is that the buildings went up, but the power, fuel, and raw materials to run them didn't materialize. Meanwhile, new high-rises have their lifts restricted to rush hour because the grid can't take it. Completed factories are sitting idle, while Kim himself has publicly berated local officials for abandoning maintenance when the cameras left. All the while, the nighttime satellite imagery still shows illumination concentrated in downtown Pyongyang, while most of the rest of the country stays dark. Which brings us to the number that doesn't quite fit. Because while the economy grew 3.5%, North Korea's currency fell apart. In mid-2024, the market rate was somewhere around 8,000 to 8,900 won to the dollar. By January this year, it was 37,250. In April, rates in Pyongyang, Sinuiju, and Haisan broke 70,000 for the first time on record, a 30% move in a fortnight and roughly 80% depreciation year on year, before peaking at 70,800 in May. And the price of food went with it. Rice was around 5,000 won a kilo 2 years ago, but by this summer it had surged to roughly 40,000 won in Pyongyang. Corn, which is what most of the poorer households eat, went from 3,600 won per kilo to over 8,000 in the same window, and petrol prices doubled. Now, to be clear, all of those figures come from defector-run monitoring networks like Daily NK, phoning traders on smuggled handsets. But the state's behaviour seems to line up with the numbers. It's been paying cooperative farm workers in cash rather than grain since mid-2024, and because nobody trusts the won, they convert it immediately, which makes the problem worse. In May, the cabinet tried to cap rice prices by decree, and the wholesalers vanished and the stalls emptied. Private foreign currency trading was banned, money changers were rounded up, and the collapse was officially blamed on unfounded rumours. So, there is economic growth in artillery shells, tungsten, cement, and state construction. The state orders it, consumes it, and dollars and rubles land in the hands of the regime. Meanwhile, the market's ordinary North Korean shopping increasingly run on foreign currency, while any wages are still paid in won. According to some estimates, a doctor's monthly salary no longer buys a single kilogram of rice. The country is expanding if you look at its GDP, but it's getting more difficult for most ordinary North Koreans at the same time. Now, for 15 years, a UN panel of experts tracked and published North Korean sanctions violations. In March 2024, though, Russia vetoed its renewal, China abstained, and by April the panel had ceased to exist. The replacement, formed that October, is the Multilateral Sanctions Monitoring Team. 11 countries, no Security Council mandate, and no enforcement power whatsoever. So the old system wasn't beaten. Russia helped shut it down while becoming one of North Korea's biggest customers. And that gets us to the heart of the matter here. Instead of reforming its economy, the North Korean regime found new buyers and some niche ways to accumulate wealth. Weapons, soldiers, and hackers, 3 exports that have given North Korea's GDP number a big boost. But most of that relies on a single war. A ceasefire in Ukraine would remove the shell orders, the soldiers' wages, the discounted oil and grain in one stroke. And what would be left beyond that wouldn't be able to keep the lights on in newly finished tower blocks. So, the most sanctioned economy out there found a way to grow by making itself indispensable to one customer and one customer only. North Korea might be booming, but that boom is fragile if the regime isn't ready to actually transform its economy. At the 9th Party Congress in February, Kim Jong-un laid out a 5-year defense plan running to 2030, rejected denuclearization, and put self-reliance and weapons production at the center of it. That is most definitely not the plan of a man expecting the fighting to stop anytime soon, and something tells me he won't be changing course on his economic strategy either. But what do you think? Will this North Korean economic revival last, or is it ultimately a dead end for a regime that's struggling? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you want to understand what's actually happening to Russia's war economy, then you can check out our video on that right over here. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Guy, signing off.